In each of these cases, though the scriptures do not specifically document the restoration of the world through transplantation, we do know this happened from general comments made by the early brethren. This does not mean, however, that the scriptures do not record the transplantation of vegetable and animal life after these cataclysms symbolically. In fact, when the planetary symbolism of the prophetic tradition is applied to certain visions and parables, the cyclical transplantation as the replenishment of the earth is firmly established. The book of Acts records a remarkable vision seen by Peter while he lodged with a tanner named Simon in Joppa. The point of the vision, of course, was to inform the president of the church that the gospel of Christ was not restricted to the Jews. The Gentiles were now considered clean and could be taught the gospel and be baptized. For our purposes, however, it is the vision of the sheet with animals that bears further scrutiny. Scholars, of course, have offered many opinions as to the symbolism of the sheet, but none have explained the vision in its totality. Nor have they considered the possibility that the symbolism can be found in the myths and lore of other cultures. It should not be surprising that another ancient culture would tell the same story as Peter's net. The story is based upon the planetary symbolism of the polar configuration, which was seen and known by all the nations of the ancient world. During the annual Makahiki festival, which honored the god Lono, the ancient Hawaiians performed a ceremony that is an exact parallel to Peter's vision. Another version of the myth identifies Makaliki as the heavenly benefactor. In this version, rats nibble away the ropes of the net, releasing the food. The Maasai of Africa tell of the lowering of cattle from heaven to earth. In this story, a leather thong is used instead of a sheet. A closer look into the stories of the great sheet or net filled with animals reveals a deep and important pattern, one that connects the vision of Peter with the great flood of Noah's dispensation. In all three cases, there is a heavenly repository of animals, not native to earth. In Peter's case, it is a sheet, in the Hawaiian version, it is a net, and in the flood version, it is a heavenly ark. All three repositories are oriented to the four cardinal directions or quarters of the earth. We need to remember that all three accounts are describing mythic archetypes. The ark, in this case, is not really a boat, but a symbol derived from the polar configuration. The image that Peter saw, as did the Hawaiians, looked like this. The yellow disk of Saturn formed the sheet and net. They were gathered at the four corners of the Earth, represented by the four plasma streamers from Venus extending to the rim of Saturn's circle. The ark was the heavenly boat, formed by the rotating crescent on Saturn's surface. The animals of the sheet, net, and ark were the same animals seen by John in his vision. The archetype was the tetramorph, which represented four classes of beings. The four beasts of John's vision adheres to the quartered pattern of the sheet, net, and ark. The quartered pattern shown here is the archetype of the heavenly city, the Garden of Eden, and heaven itself. Now, as such, it represents the repository of the animals let down by the sheet and net and transported by the ark. After Noah had offered sacrifice to the Lord upon leaving the ark, the Lord gave a commandment to Noah pertaining to food, just as he had to Adam at the beginning of his dispensation. Yet the command was different because the flood had dramatically changed the conditions on earth. The Lord commanded Noah to eat meat for the first time. Under the new conditions, meat would be necessary for survival. Like Noah, Peter was commanded in his vision to kill unclean animals for meat for the first time. The correspondence between the vision of Peter, the myth of Lono, and the story of Noah's Ark is a deep one. This is a product of the archetypes of the polar configuration, which provide a means of generating numerous symbols and crosses cultures. Every ancient nation saw the same images. Sometimes the images were interpreted differently, and sometimes they were interpreted in remarkably similar ways. The archetypes also allow for symbolism to be used and interpreted in two directions, from archetype to symbol to meaning, and from archetype to the polar configuration to ancient physical history. The Lord used the planetary archetypes to teach Peter about the change in status of the Gentiles. They were now to be considered clean. The pedagogical method was the use of the polar configuration in forming symbols, such as the sheet and the beasts, which were then used to teach a gospel principle. This is the normal application of the gospel archetypes. But the archetypes can be used in reverse, where the flow of logic begins with the archetypes and then moves to the planets behind them and finally to the physical history underlying it all. In his vision, Peter saw the heaven open and a sheet appear with animals. The animals seen by Peter were divided into four classes, just as in John's vision: four-footed beasts, wild beasts, creeping things, and fowls of the air. The animal groupings do not match, but it is the pattern that matters. Noah took four classes of animals into the ark likewise. Now we know from the Lord's explanation that these four types of animals represented classes of beings. This archetype indicates there are living beings, animals, in the heavenly realm. And we know from Joseph Smith and John himself that the apostles saw real living beasts in heaven, in addition to their symbolic representations. Joseph then cited John's statement in chapter 5 of Revelation to support his claim. Digging deeper into the physical component of the archetype, we note that John saw real animals on a real world, which he identified as heaven. Anciently, heaven was the planet Saturn, but heaven was also the congregation of planets, which we know to have consisted of Saturn, Venus, Mars, and Jupiter. There may have been others which were not visible to the ancients. If we follow this line of logic to its conclusion, it points to an event where real animals descended to the earth. It appeared that these animals descended in the sheet, net, or ark, since the planetary images filled the sky and would have provided a backdrop for the descent. The planet or planets of origin of the animals would remain unknown. In this logic flow, we move from the archetypes, the quartered heaven, the sheet, and the 4 classes of animals to the planets of the polar configuration, constituting heaven above and the repository of the animals, and to the historical event, the transplantation and descent of the animals to Earth. Neither the vision of Peter, the Hawaiian story of the net, or the story of Noah and the ark provides a specific identification of the planet or planets that provided the animals. All we can presume is that they were real and close to Earth. This same vision was seen by the prophet Malachi. Its symbolic structure is the same, though some of the details have changed. In Malachi's version, the great net becomes the windows of heaven. The animals are meat, meaning food. The descent of the sheet becomes the pouring out of blessings. Hunger is replaced by the devour, which is destroying the fruits of the ground, likely causing famine. Heaven remains heaven. The windows of heaven of Malachi are the same windows which opened to flood the earth in Noah's time. There are 4 windows, as there were 4 quarters of the sheet, net, and ark. Each quarter of the heaven above became a window. The repeated restocking of the Earth through transplantation after extinction events explains the mystery of the geologic column, the presence of new species in each layer of the column. After each cleansing of the Earth of its life, new life forms were introduced. Many of these new forms would become extinct in the next extinction event and thereby show up in the fossil record. The process was repeated for each major catastrophic event. It may also now be possible to connect the fossil record with the historical record. We have the fossil record with its well-defined layers. We have the historical record with its well-documented catastrophes. All that needs to be done, if possible, is to marry them together. Animals were not the only form of life transplanted to Earth. Plant life was as well. And with each new layer of the geologic column, new plants appear in fossil form. Science interprets this as evolutionary progression. However, the new flora simply appear in the fossil record. Again, there are no transitional forms. The ancients witnessed the transplantation of vegetable life from heaven and recorded it. We learned from the Hawaiian account of the Makali'i festival that vegetable life was let down to earth by the net, as was animal life. One of the food plants new to the earth was the sweet potato. We know this because it was the planetary god Lono that introduced its cultivation to the Hawaiian people. The Bantu tell the story of how vegetables first came to earth from the dead body of the deity, elephant. The inhabitants of ancient Asia also believed that rice and other grains came from the dead body of a god. More recent texts say that these grains came directly from heaven or the netherworld. The grains did not originate on earth. The Creek of North America tell of 4 men from the 4 corners of the earth who gave them 7 plants before disappearing in the cloud. The Choctaw discovered corn, according to one legend, when a crow from far away beyond the waters brought a grain of corn to a young orphan child. The origin myths of vegetation are too numerous to recite in their totality here. The important point is that the ancient legends are universal and unanimous in the heavenly origin of plant life. Among the numerous mythic archetypes used to describe the origin of vegetable life on Earth is the tree of life. Throughout the myths of the ancient world, a miraculous tree, tall enough to reach heaven, showered down plants, fruits, and seeds to a grateful mankind. For the Greeks, it was Jupiter's oak tree, from which acorns fell to earth. In Borneo, there is a tradition of a tree which man can climb to heaven and obtain useful seeds. The Akawois of British Guiana believe that at the beginning of the world, there was a great and wonderful tree with many kinds of fruits on its branches. The tree was cut down so that its seeds could be spread and cultivated. It was this same tree that caused the flood. The Caiapoa Brazil recall a fantastic tree of their own, which provided the seeds used in agriculture for the first time. In the highlands of Guatemala, the Maya still believed that a tree at the center of all things scattered its seeds to the world. The Hebrews have their own version of the story. When he created the Garden of Eden for Adam and Eve, the Lord placed in it two supernatural trees, the tree of knowledge, of good and of evil, and the tree of life. Like the mythic trees of other nations, both trees were so large that they reached heaven. Rabbinical tradition describes the tree as being so large that it would take 500 years to traverse the diameter of its trunk. The tree of life represents the love of God in Nephi's vision. However, its original meaning was the gift of immortality. The gift of eternal life, represented by the tree of life, is given to all those who obey God's commandments and overcome. As Alma explained, eating the fruit leads to the joy of everlasting life. Nephi explained to his brethren, Laman and Lemuel, that the tree of life was the greatest of all the gifts. The greatest gift of all God's gifts is eternal life. When used to this symbolic purpose, the tree is more aptly called the tree of eternal life. If we apply the archetype of the tree of life in the reverse mode, as we did with the great sheet of heaven, we find that the biblical version of the tree becomes like those of the mythologies of the ancient world. The Hebrew tree of life provides fruit, vegetables, and seed to the world at a time of great need. In John's revelation, the apostle sees the tree on either side of the pure river of water of life. Like the Akawoy's tree, in particular, the tree of life was laden with all manner of fruit. Fruit will fall from the celestial tree for the reconstitution of the world after its cleansing. The Lord intended to establish an earthly paradise for his millennial reign. But to do so, life will need to be imported from the heavens. Animals, plants, and seeds will descend to earth as it has before. The scene will look as if the tree of life is yielding its fruit to mankind. The curse will be taken away, healing the earth and its nations. As the first garden of the Lord was stocked with animals and vegetation brought from other planets, so will the second. The parables of the sower and the sower of the good seed tell the same story as the great sheet and the tree of life. The imagery is different, but the planetary basis is the same. In these parables, a sower sows his field. Now we know from the explanation of the parable of the sower of the good seed that the field is the world. It is the planet Earth. This parable is about the destruction of the wicked by fire in preparation for the return of Jesus Christ. From the book of Revelation, we know that the angels of heaven will burn the earth with fire. They will do so with the assistance of the host of heaven, the planets. In other words, the parable is not about normal agricultural pursuits and the primary actors reside in heaven. By stripping the parable of its symbolic overlay, we find the following. Seeds descend from heaven to the earth. A human figure appears in the heavens like a sower from which the seeds descend. The figure is the heaven man of the polar configuration. Like the tree of life, the sower uses historical events to prefigure a future event, when the Lord will restock the earth after killing off all life, in part by the transplantation of seeds. In passing, we should note that the harvesting of the field mentioned in the parable of the sower of the good seed also has its symbolic basis in the polar configuration. A certain phase of the configuration is called the plant of life. In the parable, the plasma streams emanating from Venus becomes the awn of a wheat plant. The peg-like extension earthward from Mars becomes the stem. The rotating crescent acts like a sickle or scythe, cutting the wheat as it crosses the stem.